Hi everyone, this is Kelly from The Truth in Story, and I'm here just to do a basic rundown of how I associate the tarot cards. Just sort of basic correspondences. They're questions that I get asked a lot. They're answers in a variety of different videos, but I thought I would just do one video just going over the basics of the structure and the breakdown and the correspondences that I put on the deck of tarot cards. So you can see here in a large part, especially if I pull these little piles down a little bit of a ways here, we can see that in some ways, while we think of the tarot as being often split into two groups, which it is, what is traditionally called the major arcana or the trump cards, and these are 22 cards. The Fool is very often unnumbered or at 0. Some decks do put it at 22, so that can change, but for the most part, in a modern sense, people think of the Fool as sort of 0 or standing outside of the number structure, which is very key to tarot. But there are 22 cards in the trumps, or what is called the majors, and they very often follow, and we're going to have these all laid out and you'll be able to see them individually. Right now we're talking a little bit in larger scope. That they're often seen as being larger, bigger arcing energy. So for example, if a tower shows up which is a shift, right? There's a big shakeup going on. If that shows up in a reading, and say maybe a 6 of Swords, which is also a shift, that tower shift is much more larger, much more impactful to a broader range around the person, whereas the shift that the 6 of Swords might indicate would be more of a personal nature, maybe a little bit smaller. Now, not everybody reads them that way, but that is often an association, that the larger are often to be either larger events or sometimes more spiritual, sort of major personality, major life sort of lessons that are happening on an internal level or on a larger external level for the major arcana. And then we have the minor arcana, which are the also sometimes called Pip cards, if you're like me. They represent basically a playing card deck. So originally you would have had a playing card deck of various different denominations. They were not all 52 cards. They were different. Sometimes they were ace to 10. Sometimes in some countries they were 6 to 10. Sometimes 7 to 10. But the tarot as we know it came from a playing card deck that would have been from ace to 10. And then having the court cards that sometimes had 4 courts and sometimes had 3 courts. And so from that was added a trick taking in terms of a games. The trumps were added in. And so that created, to combine together the major and the minor arcana, combined together to become what we know as a 78 card tarot deck. So in some ways it's split into 2, major, minor. In other ways you can think of it as sort of three distinct chunks within the deck, which would be the major arcana, the minor arcana, and then the court system. So, because those can be read often very differently, whereas the major arcana might be major issues and or internal shifts and changes that have great impact. The minor arcana might be life, just getting in there, and life, day-to-day practical life issues, going from 1 to littlest and 10 to largest, and a lot of different things in between. The court cards, depending on how you read them, traditionally there is a tradition in which you read these as actual people, and there are different hair colors and looks associated with the different suits. Sometimes, so some people read them as actual people. Again, this is a reading or a video on how I associate the tarot deck. And so one of the ways that I read that is, again, as we just said, the court cards to me are how does the energy move. So if in tarot, as is the case for me, we have 4 suits. So the minor arcana is further split down into 4 suits that we can see represented by the aces. So we have the coins, which for me, I associate with the element of earth. We have cups, which I associate with the element of water. We have wands, which I associate with the element of fire. And we have swords, which I associate with the element of air. There are different ways to associate. Those are fairly common. They're the associations in the Rider-Waite-Smith version of the deck, of the tarot deck, and so it is probably one of the most common. You will sometimes, even today, see the swords and the wands switched, where sword is associated with fire. Makes sense, it's forged in fire, and wands are associated with air because you wave it around in the air maybe and do magical things. So sometimes you see those switched. In some older style decks, I have actually seen the swords and the cups switched, where swords are water, you forge it in fire, but then you put it out and it becomes finalized in water, and water as air, a kind of springy air energy. So there are, none of these associations are set in stone. You will find exceptions to anything that I'm going to say from here on out. The only thing I would say that is pretty much not, argued is that there's a major and a minor arcana. I've never heard anybody really argue that separately. Although, certainly in the early 1900s and probably late 1800s, it was argued that the only part that mattered was the major arcana, which I certainly disagree with. So, as I was saying, because each of the minor arcana is split into 4 groupings of the 4 elements, for me personally, elemental energy is part and parcel to any type of divination that I do. The question is, what is the energy that's going on in the situation, and how is it moving? For me, the court cards very much represent, for me, how is that energy moving. So if we have the suit of coins here, the court card represents how is a suit of the element of earth. How is that physicality, the money, the work aspect of our energy moving? For the page or the valet, sometimes you'll see it as a princess. That would be learning. It's initiating. It's just starting out. It's beginning energy, how it's moving. If it is so these are all valets for the different suits. If it is a knight, the knights very often are on horses. They are out there questing, initiating, moving. It's very moving aspect of their element. So in here, emotions of the cups, relationships are in movement. They're in flux. The Knight of Cups is off to find the Holy Grail. The Knight of Coins is moving usually slower, but he's moving, plodding along towards stability, towards grounding, towards financial gain, these types of things. The Knight of Wands, he's off searching for the next best place to build a castle or to create in some way or to manifest in some way, but it's a moving energy. And the Knight of Swords, he is off to save the damsel in distress. He's running willy-nilly. Sometimes he's a little bit erratic and needs to bring it in, but it's active, moving energy with the knights. The queens are very much the nurturers. They are the 4 aspects of motherhood. However we may see motherhood, we can see it in 4 different ways. We can see that earthy, grounded Mother Earth energy with the Queen of Pentacles. With the Queen of Cups, we really see that full-on nurturer. This is the, come give me hugs. This is the, this kind of just that fully supportive, nurturing energy. The Queen of Wands is inspiring. She's inspirational. She is in the seat of her power. She is transforming things. She is creating things. And the Queen of Swords, she's the empathetic. She is, her power is very rooted from difficult times, from the sharper aspects of life that have taught her, the lessons that she has learned. It's more intellectual, the more logical aspect of motherhood. So we can see it in those 4 faces of mothering energy. But I love, in particular, what Mary White with the Marielle talked about with the queens as creating the environment for their energy to grow. They're laying the groundwork so that the energy of their suit can continue to grow. The kings are very much mini emperors of their suit. So if the emperors are there to create order out of chaos, the kings are very much along those lines. And again, we've got the practical, earthy king. We've got the nurturing, loving King of Cups here. We've got the creative, fire-filled king in the wands. And we have the smart, intellectual, making clear, concise, good decisions, king of swords. But they are very much creating order. They are also making decisions that affect more than just themselves, but their greater good of their kingdom that is around them. So in a nutshell, and again, this is completely taken in this, what the nutshell I'm going to give you right now is completely taken from Mary White's version of the quartz. But in a nutshell, in terms of energetic movement, the pages, sometimes called princesses or daughters, that is the initiating and learning energy. The knights, which are usually called knights or cavaliers, sometimes sons, those are the energy of moving. They're questing. They are they're out there, not initiating, they're questing. They're out there moving, questing. The queens, which are often queens, sometimes they are mothers, and they are the ones that are creating the environment for their energy to grow. And the kings, which are usually kings or fathers, are those that are creating order and structure and making solid decisions of their energy. So that would be how I see the court cards, and how I see the breakdown of the minors in terms of elemental associations. Now, people always ask me about how I see them in terms of seasons. That is something that you can ask so many different people and get so many different answers. And I always hold the power to change my mind at some point. But at this current moment in time, at the beginning of 2018, I definitely see the coins as earth, and I also associate earth with fall. I see it as that beginning of fall, which is the harvesting, and the later part of fall in which things start to drop away. But that kind of cycle of the earth, I see with the coin suit, or the suit of earth. With the cups, I very much associate that with spring. It is water, life-giving water, starts everything blooming again. The frozen snow is melting and allowing things to grow. We're starting to get more rain and things are beginning to grow. And I associate with the suit of cups with spring. I associate wands with fire, and I associate that with with summer. The sun is highest in the sky. It is warmth out. It is fire. People are energized in the summer, and I see that as summer energy. And then finally, swords, I associate with air, and I associate with winter. There is something clear and sharp about the cold energy of winter. We notice what is going on with the air when we walk outside and we have that cutting sharp air, cold air of winter. We are well aware of it. We're paying attention to the temperatures. And there's just a clarity and a cleanness that I think really work in winter, that really work well with the energy of air. Those are my associations. They are not written in stone. That is something that is layered on tarot, and like I said, you can ask 4 or 5 different people the same question and you're going to see a variety of answers to that. But those are my seasonal associations to the minors. So let's put these back here. So that's how, there's the basic breakdown. The other, so for me, what is very much base associations are the elemental breakdowns, which we've just talked about, how I see the court cards as moving energy, and then the next really important component for me is the numbers. So how do the numbers associate? And we're going to connect those to all the cards, but just before I kind of move things around, I'm just going to go through a quick basic of how I see the number system. So the ones or the aces, I see as that beginning. It's that spark. It is that potential. Now, aces are also indicating of the full fruition of their suit. But in terms of numbers, the number 1 is that new beginning energy. The number 2 is a number of balance, of polarity and duality. So it can be things that are pushing against each other, and it can be things that are attracting each other, but it is that number of 2 and how those 2 relate. It's a relational number. Number 3 is a number of growth. 2 creates the 1, which becomes 3, and so we have that idea of creation, that idea of growth. Number 4, that energy is stabilizing. You have a 4-legged chair or table. They have a sense of stability that is there. So number 4 is about stability. Can that become stagnation? Yes, but technically I'd probably see that more in the 8s, the potential for stagnation to be higher in the 8s, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But the shadow aspect of stability could be stagnation, which is what you see in a lot of the 4s of the Rider-Waite-Smith. Number 5 is a number of disruption. It's shaking the status quo. It's breaking up that for stability there. It doesn't mean it's negative, but it can be. It can be a shake-up number. Things are, whoa. And truthfully, if you look at many of the odd numbers, we do have a little bit of a shake-up, but I'll come back to that. We go to 6, in which things are reharmonized. There is a harmonizing and a rebalancing that takes place in 6s. In 7th, we often have a new growth that is occurring, and you can very often see it best in a Pip card, which a Pip just means a card that does not have scenes on it. It just has numbers of items. So this is a Pip deck that has, instead of a picture of what the 7 of coins might be doing, what might be happening, it simply has 7 coins in it. But there are things that you can learn from the structure. 4 plus 3 is 7. 4 is stability and 3 is growth. We have growth coming out of stability. But the number 7 for me in general is looking at new growth. The number 8 is looking at really heavy structure, 4 plus 4, stability plus stability. It can lead to stagnation, I think faster than the 4s, but it also has that sense of mastery that often comes into play with the number 8s. Number 9s are also very disruptive, but very powerful disruption. This is what, in a keyword, I would say it's dynamic energy. There is a lot of energy going on in the 9s, bouncing off the wall energy. That can be, again, positive and negative depending on the question, depending on what's going on. Number 10 is about completion. It's coming full circle into the completion of that suit. Again, we can also look at number 1 as being a little and number 10 as being a lot, and sort of a progression of energy as well, which is very useful way to look at when you're just kind of scanning. Do you have a lot of high numbers or do you have a lot of low numbers? So paying attention to the progression of 1 being a little and 10 being a lot is important. And again, in terms of shake-up numbers, you can see that in the odd numbers. 3 is growth, right? So we may find our balance with a 2, but growth always causes a shift, right, and a change. We might have the stability in the 4, but the 5 causes that sort of a shake-up and a disruption. We might harmonize things in the 6, but 7, we've got new growth. And again, it's not that it's negative, but growth is always destabilizing. We've got that structure come back in the 8, and then in the 9, we have that sort of dynamic energy bouncing around, which is good. It can be a period of high energy and a lot of potential there, but it can be also very disruptive to be in that high state of frenzy and then stabilizing again with the 10s. So you can look at those even and odds and kind of see again this progression of stabilizing, then destabilizing, stabilizing, then destabilizing. You can see that in a really powerful way as well. And so in a nutshell, that is how I see the numbers. And so if you think about how much easier that is to learn than, say, 56 minor cards, if you are learning what are the 4 elements and what do they mean for you, and you are learning the numbers, you can plug that in. So if Ace is a new beginning and Earth is about stability and physicality and our everyday life, that physical act of living and going about our day, we can see some new beginnings there. If we have cups are about emotions and feelings, and then how those emotions and feelings connect out to others in our relationships, right? Then we can see the ace as new beginnings and new potentials in the way that the state of our emotions or the state of our relationships. Wands, if the wands are about fire and creativity and transformation, they're the manifestation, something being transformed and manifested. And so if we have an ace there, okay, well, we've got new beginnings. We got the first spark and new beginnings of a creative phase, perhaps. If swords are about air, they're about the mind, they're about decisions, choices and decisions. They're also about communication. How do we communicate the things that we know? And so if we have the ace here, we have that spark, this new way of thinking, new way of processing in the mind, perhaps a new way of communicating as well, because we have an ace and we have the energy of its suit. And so it becomes really easy to do a bit of an equation that says, okay, 3 means growth. I have a 3 here and I have a cup here. We have growth of emotions, and we can kind of plug those in. And so instead of having to memorize 56 cards, you're memorizing 10 numbers. What do those numbers mean to you? And 4 elements. And what do the suits mean to you? And it becomes quite a great way to be able to learn the minors. Kellyanne Maddox has a really good video where she talks about this in her tarot beginning class, tarot beginners class, and so one of those she talks about that idea of plugging these in, and you'll see that in various places, but her video is really fantastic in kind of how can you plug those numbers and those elements or suits together and be able to very quickly figure out what that card could stand for. So that's in a nutshell how I see numbers. But now let's see, how do those numbers also start to relate between the major arcana. Okay, so here we have the major arcana set out in a set of 10, 10, and then we've got these 2. We have the full completion with the World card in 21, and then we have the Fool card, who could be at the very beginning, he could be at the very end. Personally, I think he exists all over the place, right? Because he often can represent the reader or who you're reading for, the querent, and where they are in that. And if he shows up in a reading, it's that sort of understanding, okay, we're starting fresh. There's this new beginning here. There's this beginning step that we're going to start taking in. Because one of the things I love about the Fool is that almost never do you see, there's one deck that I know, I believe it's the Mythic Tarot, where it's the Fool is just coming out of a cave, but we pretty much never see the Fool like just beginning to leave his house. He's generally in the Rider-Waite-Smith. He is up and off onto the top of a mountain, so he's already had a big journey, right? And so it's now the next step. It's that next new beginning. So we have the Fool there, and he can kind of float around. And then, of course, we have the full completion in the world card coming full circle and completing. But then we have, because we've been talking about the minors where we have sets of numbers 1 through 10, we have 2 sets of 10, right? 1 through 10, and then we have 11 through 20 as a set as well. And so you can begin to see 2 sets where we have, now again, I'm using in this deck, let's pause for a moment here. So this is the generally accepted order, right? Again, Fool could be at the very beginning, could be at the very end. Generally, it's sometimes unnumbered, but very often it's number 0. So it kind of stands outside the circle. And then number 21 is obviously at the very end here. So this is pretty set with how, especially in modern times, you will see the ordering of the major arcana. The difference that you will often see has to do with the number 11 and the number 8 card. Now, in Rider-Waite-Smith's based decks, so the Rider-Waite-Smith deck was a deck that was created by Arthur E. Waite, illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith in the early 1900s, and instead of having minors such as these with pips, meaning they're like playing cards. This is the 7 of cups, and there are 7 cups. So instead of having pips, it would actually have a scene. And now in the Rider-Waite-Smith, there actually is 7 cups, I believe, with different things in it. But very often there are people acting out scenes and making it more accessible to the general public. Also, it's very much the purpose of the Rider-Waite-Smith is to kind of solidify or correspond to Golden Dawn correspondences. And so the sceneries in which we see acting out have to do with the correspondences from the Golden Dawn, a group that Arthur E. Waite as well as Pamela Coleman Smith were part of, like an esoteric group. They changed the Justice card, which in most older style decks, I don't want to say all, because there are a lot of Marseille style decks or older historical decks that didn't even have numbering on the majors. So I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them that are put in some order, Justice is at 8 and Strength is at 11. Because of, I believe, astrological correspondences, Rider-Waite-Smith or Arthur E. Waite changed Strength to be 8 and Justice to be 11. So there are many decks that would be considered sort of Rider-Waite-Smith recreations that will leave that. There are some decks that still have some Rider-Waite-Smith correspondences, but will keep the Justice at 8 and Strength at 11. There are also many Pip decks that have Pip styles, but they keep the Rider-Waite-Smith. So you're going to see differences sometimes between, but the general rule, very broad rule, is that when they are kind of historically based and more of these Marseille style or Pip style decks, they very often then keep Justice at 8 and Strength at 11. But if it is a Rider-Waite-Smith clone or recreation, you will see Strength at 8 and Justice at 11. So those are the two that you will often see switched. I quite like when modern decks just don't number the major arcana, because then it's just not it doesn't matter how you tend to see that. And it only really matters when you're looking at, if you're kind of looking at the progression. It also can matter if you use numerology, right? So whether or not Justice connects with the 8s in a deck, or Justice connects to, or Justice connects to 11s, which would be 1s, that can change depending on whether or not which way you have this. So for the most part, it doesn't bother me what way a deck has it, because I read Justice as Justice and Strength as Strength, and for the most part, it doesn't inhibit me from using it one way or another. My preference is Justice at 8 and Strength at 11. And that's because I see, so in, if we're going to go by numbers, so if we look at the aces, of course, as being 1, right, they're going to be connected to the Magician, all that sense of possibilities. That, remember, the aces are both the beginning and the full potential of their suit, and so we can really see that with the Magician. He has the full potential within him. And then when you think about the number 11 here, so we're starting over again with 1, and we see those together, the full potential of us is actually resides within us. That's a very similar message that we have with, and also that idea of having yin and yang in balance within each other. You've got the masculine, you've got the feminine, you've got the civilized, you've got the animal. It actually, to me, works really well numerologically. And so my preference is Strength at 11 and Justice at 8. But that's my personal preference. So let's go back to looking at the major arcana. So I want to point that out. Sometimes you'll see those differences. So we start, the Fool starts off on his journey, right? When we come to the first card is the Magician. I'm just nutshelling this. Like, this is massively nutshelling because I'm just giving you key correspondences in this video. The Magician is that understanding that we have everything that we need within ourselves. The 4 elements are usually somewhere on the table. Now, historical decks, it can be a cobbler and it can be a street magician, and there's a little bit more of a shadow aspect to the Magician, of more of that trickster energy. But generally in modern decks, the Magician shows all 4 elements, and it's that kind of understanding of you having everything that you need within yourself. The High Priestess, in some historical decks, this will be called the Pappas, but the High Priestess is that idea of our intuition. It usually has waters at her feet. She's got crescent moons at her feet. She's got holy books in her hands. This is a deep esoteric knowledge. This is going deep, right? Number 3 is the Empress, and this is number 3 is the number of growth and creation, right? And so we can see that in the Empress. She is about that idea of creation and growth, but she's also the seat of the feminine power. So that idea of a Mother Earth style Empress, which is technically Mother Earth, or the Queen of Pentacles, right? But that idea of the Empress as Mother Earth, kind of Gaia energy, that's a little bit of a later creation. She's much more in historical decks. She is that feminine ruler, that seat of feminine power that coexists with the masculine power of the Emperor. But you do get that sense of creation, her power being through the power of creation. We have the Emperor, who is again about creating order out of chaos. He is, has conquered or is conquering his territory through sometimes force, certainly through wise rulership in the positive state of things, but it's about order and structure. We have structure also in some ways being disrupted. I always find this really interesting because the number 5 is the Pope, which is also the High Priest often, or the Hierophant. So you'll see sometimes those kinds of terminology, and it's about structured religion in a way. It's about traditions. It's about passing down traditions. But what's interesting is that it's a number 5, which is that shake up. Like, oh, maybe we need to shake up organized religion and not get so restricted. I quite like that little. I feel like that's a little nudge at the established religion of when decks were coming out. We have number 6, which is the Lover's card. So Lover's card is about, the 6 is about harmony. And so if we think about the 6 with the Lover's card, we have that having a balanced or harmonized choices and decision. Historical decks, you'll often see a single male, sometimes a female, choosing between two people, making that choice. Sometimes it's just the male, a man and a woman, and a Cupid or an angel as well. But that's really, for me, it's not a love card. That would be more the Two of Cups, but it is much more about making decisions that are in balance or in tune with your higher self, your conscious self, and your subconscious self. We have the Chariot, which is my birth card, card number 7. And this is a card of movement, right? But confident movement. Standing in your chariot. Sometimes they don't even have the reins. Sometimes they do have the reins. Horses are usually going in different directions. So you see very high energy in the horses, but the charioteer has firm control over it. I love historical ones because they literally look like they're just like in these huge blocks that couldn't possibly move. And you think these poor horses. But you do get also that idea of the 7. Remember, I talked about the 7 being growth from stability, movement from stability. So we have the stable, really 4-poster feeling bed post structure in some of the older decks, and yet there is movement coming from that. So it does work with the idea of the 7s as well. But confidence and movement forward. Then we have, if you're following along the way that I do, you have Justice at 8. I love, again, the 4 plus 4. You do have that sense of balance there. You do have that stricture and structure, because Justice is about clarity. Justice is about seeing through to the watery emotions, cutting through that and seeing the truth. So it is much more of a structure. You got a legal system. There's much more of a sense of structure there that really, for me, works with the idea of the 8s. But for me in general, Justice is cutting through emotions and seeing clearly, seeing the truth. Then we have the Hermit card here in number 9. Sometimes he's called Time. I've seen that as well in older decks. Some of the older decks often have a crutch. Sometimes they have an hourglass as well. I love Hermits that have hourglass. So Hermit's one of my favorite cards. And so that's that idea of kind of going away. And I love that it's the 9, right? So if the 9 is about having all of this energy, dynamic energy. So this Hermit has gathered up all of this knowledge and just is teeming with knowledge, and is now needing to kind of go away and coalesce that information into wisdom. And he's shining that light also for others to follow. I quite like that with the 9s. And that brings us to the first complete round of the Wheel of Fortune, and coming full circle into that understanding that then another cycle is just going to start all over again. Tarot is a deck, because of the numerological structure, that really reflects that beginnings and endings, beginnings and endings, beginnings and endings, in a really beautiful way. And you can just see that there. Okay, we've come full circle. Life's going to change again. Bam, now we're starting another group of 10. So that brings us to, if you're following my patterns, the Strength card, which I've already talked about. That idea of working again with ones makes sense to me. That coming into full strength of what's within really has that, is what allows strength to grow. So that net beginning, that new beginning, that manifesting, you're manifesting strength by you're bringing together this kind of harmonizing of the outer and the inner self, is going to manifest strength outward as the magician manifests into the real world. In the number 12, which would then be the second 2, right? So these are all kind of going together. We have the Hanged Man. And so this is interesting because the High Priestess is diving deep. The Hanged Man, now, in older decks, this was actually a traitor card. So this is a little bit more of a consequence card. It can be in some of the historical style decks. There are a couple I've even seen where they were hung around the neck. But in general, more modern interpretations, it tends to be a little bit more associated with Odin, where you have Odin hanging on the tree. Sometimes there will be water or a pool of water here where he gathered the runes. And so the idea of being willing, what are you willing to sacrifice in order to gain knowledge, ties very well with the High Priestess. Gaining a new perspective, which is often a key word for the Hanged Man, is also something that goes really well with that understanding of the twos and bringing things into balance. But with a hangman, you're flipping that on its head so that you're able to see a new perspective. And 13, now in older style decks, very often death is not numbered. So like the Fool, death stands outside of this whole process. But it's usually placed would be, seems to be placed in the 13th slot. And certainly in a modern deck, death would be in the 13th. Which is interesting too as well, right? Creation. So you have that actual moment of creation in the Empress, and you have that kind of full circle growth and that you have into the next phase, right? That there's always beginnings and endings, and you can see that right here. So I think that is really lovely to see that together again with the number 3. It works really beautifully. We come to then the Temperance card with 14, and that is that idea of having the yin and the yang together. There's often 2 cups that are being poured. A lot of times you will see it as water and fire, so kind of yang and yin energy, active and receptive energy, and when you have those things kind of balanced out, that's when something new comes. Sometimes you'll even see this card called the Alchemist, but you're creating something new out of this blending, and which is what emperors very much do. They are pulling together, sometimes by force, disparate energies, and something new, this new kingdom is going to arise from that. But there has to be a lot of balance and structure there in order to do so. So for me, the Temperance card is that idea of things being in balance to some degree, but it is also that really that understanding that in some way just 2 different energies are going to come in together, and in their coming together is going to create something that's new. If you Google the Shadowscapes Temperance card, I love that because you can literally see her forming a yin and yang ball, and you can see that idea that when we work those energies together, that's where real power comes. And you can almost think of it as these 2 cards, right, creating together that in some ways. But I digress. That brings us to the Devil card. Again, you can see that mirroring of the Pope, so to speak, the head of religion, especially at that time. The Pope would have been next only to God in the religious structure, right? And then you have the devil underneath. And so you have that kind of mirroring there. And it's also both number 5. Number 5 is a disruptive number again. So we can definitely think of the Devil card and the number 5 as being disruptive. For me, the Devil card is very much about abdication of power. And in some ways, so is the shadow side of religion, right, is that abdication of power. They really do work really well together as sort of those 2 ends of the spectrum, and then again with the number 5 and that idea of disruption. So for me, when the Devil card comes up, it's about some way you're giving over your power. You often hear it associated with addiction and those kinds of things, because that is a very, you can see that abdication of power. But that happens in, from subtle ways to really obvious ways as well. So where you may have a heroin addict over here, there are many ways in which we give over our own power to someone or to some other situation. So we have that there. What I love to see here in the Tower is that it's actually a 6 number. It's a harmonizing number. From the destruction of the Tower is reharmonizing. Very often the Tower is seen as having grown too tall, grown unwieldy. There is some way in which it's out of balance. And so that destruction that comes very often out of the blue, very often of natural causes, something happens out of the blue. And yes, in that moment, it's devastating, but it allows you to start from a better, more stable place and start to rebuild in a more, it's a Tower of Babel. It gets too high and we've got to take that down a notch and then start to rebuild from a solid foundation. I love if you look at the Fountain Tarot's Tower card. I love that because you can see that once that big piece is gone, it's actually going to be able to balance itself, and now let's build a little bit more in a much more balanced way. So the Tower for me is less about the actual lightning strike, and it's more about what are you going to do now? Once the rubble has settled, what are you going to do with this? It's an opportunity. It may not be one you wanted. It may not have been a fun opportunity, but it is an opportunity to rebuild, and what are you going to do with that opportunity? So I love that in a position of a 6. That brings us to the Star card with 7. Again, growth then comes. So from the destruction comes new growth, the growth of hope, the growth of faith. I see this as sort of faith in your own self to find your way. Faith that you can look up at the stars and navigate your way forward. And so I really love that with a 7. Again, it's new growth after a really difficult situation. But it's that faith in oneself. It's confidence in oneself and faith in oneself that allows this movement forward. Just when you start to look at the numbers, it's just really, the whole system is stunning. Yes, I am very much in love with tarot, if you hadn't already known that. So that brings us to card number 18, which is the Moon card. So that's really interesting because with the Justice card at 8, if you have it there. Now again, there's nothing wrong with having those flip-flopped, but that's, you know, this is how I read them. But if you look at this, and you can make a case, you know, could I make a case for this here? Sure. The Moon card is very often about going internally, and you do have a dog and a wolf very often. You think about that civilized or domesticated with the wildness of the wolf. You can see that between the civilized woman and the wildness of the lion, going inward and that healing inward, creating the strength. You can definitely see the correlation between the two if you see those in that way. So it works either way. But I love this because there is that sense of clarity with the Justice card against the lack of clarity in the Moon card. It's dark time, it's night, it's hazy. You can't always see clearly. You have to trust your instincts more versus trusting the clear insight of truth because everything is clear and you can cut through it. So it's really a beautiful balancing. But for me, some people read the Moon as quite a negative card. I do not. I do really see it as things. I do think it's a warning card that things are in half light. So you have to listen to your instincts. At the same time, you can't always trust your instincts, right? Because in the moonlight, you can hear a branch snapping over here, and it might just be a deer or a rabbit. And in your head, you think, oh, there's a werewolf with bloody maw coming to run after me and eat me, because things can get exaggerated in the moonlight. So you can definitely read it that way, but that clarity and that non-clearness of nighttime is a beautiful counterbalance between the two of them. I love that we have the Sun here with the Hermit because he's shining out that light, where in the Sun card, you become that light. When you kind of come full circle, you own your own power, you're in the seat of your own, mastered your power, because this is it's full energy, right? It's full energy that's shining forward. People see it as a happiness card, which I do see it as happiness, but I see it as happiness that comes from having a certain degree of mastery. If number 8 is about mastery and that sort of getting things sort of structured up, then we can take that forward into the 9, and then all that energy is just shining outward. So it is all the energy of the dynamic energy of a 9, but it's just shining brightly in a really positive way that can cause growth and all this kind of wonderful goodness. It's why I don't particularly, and people laugh on my channel because they always laugh because I don't like babies and sun cards. There are lots of babies and sun cards. There are historical decks with babies and and Sun cards. So it is not just modern decks that do that. I just learned tarot on a deck with a very strong, confident man on it. And so the first time I saw a baby and a Sun card, I was like, what? It doesn't even go with how I see the Sun card, right? So at least this one just has a, it looks like two guys here. So we have that with the Sun card, that sense of happiness that comes from mastery. That brings us to 20, which is the end of our second cycle of 10, right? With the Judgment card. And the Judgment is that assessment card that says, okay, you've come full circle. Now it's time to stop. And we're going to assess where we are before we move on to this new existence that we can see, this nirvana, this heaven, this kind of coming full circle with everything in balance, everything in harmony that we have in the World card. But before we go there, let's stop for a moment, assess how did we get there, and then we'll be ready to move through the wreath, right? Through this door. If you think about that as a doorway or a window into, you know, Narnia, a mirror into Narnia or something, that first we're going to stop and we're going to assess things. You know, it comes from a religious period of time. The whole major arcana does. The judgment seat of Christ is where we're throwing down the works of our lives, and some of it's getting burned away because it was just, chafing. It was nothing wonderful, and some of it will stay as crowns and jewels. So it's that that's, we have that idea of the judgment seat of Christ, where we're laying our our life and our deeds and things at the feet of Christ and being judged for those. So in a modern sense, this is a time to judge and assess ourselves and say, okay, how did I get here? What choices and decisions did I make that brought me here? What choices and decisions did other people make that have affected me getting here? So what ways, I've got to own my responsibility. I also have to let go of things that I had no control over and just assess where I am. So now I can start. The rebirth comes after the assessment. It's a beautiful, powerful card. I love that card when it shows up in a reading. And of course, once you've done that assessment, you can move into this full circle. Everything is in balance. Everything is in harmony. This beautiful kind of full circle of the entire, from Fool, right, to the universe, or to the World card, or Aeon. I think Thoth type decks call it Aeon. But there is that sense of kind of full completion that comes about when we start, and we also then, right, start back over again with a 1, and it's back to a new beginning. Again, cycles upon cycles upon cycles. It's just beautiful. The tarot is a beautiful construct, right? And so what we've just talked about, in its entirety, what we've talked about here is very much just basic. People layer all kinds of other things onto tarot, right? They layer Kabbalah correspondences, astrological correspondence. Those are the two big ones. You'll see a lot of astrological correspondences, Kabbalah. Sometimes you'll see rune correspondences, all kinds of ways in which people see other systems and how they can see that system reflected in tarot. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessary. You don't have to dive headlong into astrology in order to be able to read with tarot. You don't have to know everything there is about Kabbalah in order to read with tarot. Those are extra layers. And so you might have things that are, so if you're really interested in astrology, diving into astrology with tarot might be something you're interested in. If you're interested in the Kabbalah, that might be something that you would add into it. So it just, that depends. But at a very basic level for me, again, this is all from my perspective, at its very basic level, the tarot system exists in a beautiful, almost like you think of it as gear works, just moving and shifting of cycles and movement around the understanding of energy and the 4 elements, 5th if you count spirit. So if you look at these as the 4 elements, the minors, you can look also at the major arcana as a 5th element of spirit. So you can look at the 4 or the 5 elements, and then numbers. So we're talking about energy and how is energy moving and flowing within whatever question it is that we're we're talking about. And that's how I look. That's my primary focus of how I look at the system, is what is the energy that's going on around the question or the person, and what kind of message can we get out of that. So I get asked, questions that relate to some bit of what I just, rambled about a lot. So I just thought I would kind of pull this together into one video, just as sort of, here's the basic way that I see the structure of a tarot deck. So I hope that this has been of interest to you. I hope it helps in some way, even if it's just to get you thinking about, what do you think? Like, what is it when you break your tarot deck down into pieces? What does that mean at its core base level? And what does that mean? That's going to help you to start to think through and really get that solid base. And just to say, just a little note here, I should have introduced it at the beginning, but I didn't. The deck that I'm using here is the beautiful Marshmallow Marseille from Wandering Oracle. It's a new deck that I have, so I'm really loving it. B, it is, perfect sized for this kind of thing because it is playing card size, so it allowed me to get everything into the screen, which I could not have done with a larger deck. So I wanted to say, shout out, I'm absolutely loving this deck, but I wanted to point that out before I went. So now I'm really going.